Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everyone. My name is Frederick Winsness, and I'm with NetHope and the NetHope Solutions Center. We want to welcome you here to another NetHope Solutions Center webinar with our Crisis Informatics team. And today we have a super interesting topic about how Formula One and disaster response could be combined and benefit from each other. Talking about analytics, winning the race against time. Before we introduce the speakers, I want to go over our housekeeping rules. So we want to make this as interactive as possible. So please line up your questions in the chat window. I suggest you open up the chat window by clicking the little blue bubble, the third icon to the left on the bottom of your screen. The third icon from the right, I'm sorry, on the bottom of your screen, and post your questions there, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end of the hour. We are recording this today, so you'll find both the recording and the slides and collateral on the NetHope Solutions Center posting later on today, and we encourage you to share that with your colleagues and others that might be interested in the topic. And at the very end, as we close out the webinar today, you'll see a webinar satisfaction poll show up in your browser, and we certainly would appreciate you taking a few minutes to answer those questions. Those questions will also give you an opportunity to ask to be contacted after this session by either the speakers or NetHope. So with that, I want to introduce Gabby Allman. She is with the NetHope Crisis Informatics team here at NetHope, and she's going to be introducing Peter. So over to you, Gabby.
Thank you so much, Frederick, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm really excited about today's webinar. So as Frederick mentioned, I'm Gabby. I'm with NetHope's Crisis Informatics team. We are the data shop for our consortium. And living in the age of information, there's so much for us to learn in terms of how other companies, how other corporations, how other industries do data well. And so that is what this webinar is all about today. A really interesting topic and a really interesting angle and an amazing speaker that we're going to be hearing from. So to introduce him, Peter Van Manen is an engineer. He worked in motor racing for over 20 years and was managing director of McLaren Electronics from 2003 until 2015. Under his stewardship, the company became and remains the official supplier of control and data systems to teams in Formula One, NASCAR, and IndyCar. Peter now works for Living Planet, a company that provides sensing, software, and analytics for cities. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat window. I'll be asking a few questions throughout the presentation, but we'll save most of those questions for the end of the webinar. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Peter, on to you.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to talk with you today about motor racing, which is a well-planned activity these days, but in which change can happen very rapidly and in a moment. So it's a high-impact sport. It's performed under the scrutiny of many, which I guess will sound familiar to many of you. The talk I'm giving today, I'm going to split into two parts. The first part about preparing for the race and a bit about the race itself. And the second is about how you go about winning a race. Now, I'll be talking a little bit about disaster response along the way. But I hope that as you listen, you'll start seeing a few parallels with some of the work that you guys are all doing. Okay, so let's begin. Now, Formula One, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's the largest sport that's watched in the world, largest regularly watched sport. And there's about 600 million people who view it across the world. There's hundreds of sponsors, and the racing cars that they build are complex. They're basically complex aerodynamic machines. They're traveling at very high speeds with insane accelerations. And data and analytics have really, over the years, become trusted members of the racing team. And we use data to reduce uncertainty, prevent a lot of wasted effort, and essentially save time and cost in producing racing cars. Okay, so how does this all relate to disaster recovery, disaster response? Well, what you see with disasters is they can often be foreseen, but the exact timing is hard to predict. So we have geography, weather, politics, all sorts of things that can happen long before disasters occur. But when they happen, you have a sudden, hostile and dynamic environment in which every minute counts, and that's where a lot of similarities come to motor racing. At that time, which in the figure you see in front of you is this sort of phase transition between before and after the event, everything becomes very complicated and the interactions are complicated in themselves. So that's where you can have problems with stability, things stagnating, and it can lead to all sorts of problems. You have this avalanche of activity going on, and that's where technology can help and has done in motor racing. So let's go back to Formula One for a moment. Formula One is a lot more structured than the sort of disasters that we will be talking about. But there is, in any way, a lot of complexities. And there are different time frames that all have to be managed at the same time. It takes about 3 years to develop a new engine. They allow themselves about 9 to 10 months to design build a new car. So from May of a year, they start developing, so the car is ready to hit the track in February. Once the race season begins in March, there are about 20 races at the moment, and they happen every 2 weeks, sometimes every week. And then over a race weekend, the car is on the track for about 7 hours in practice, qualifying and racing. And then as you get into the race, the pit stops themselves, they take 2 or 3 seconds. So there's a large span of times that all needs to be managed, and that in itself is complicated. So how is a racing car developed? So if we look to the next slide, we start getting a little bit of an idea. Now, the racing car itself is a complex assembly of parts, and what it's designed to do is to accelerate, move quickly, and stop quickly. Important is the aerodynamics, which create the downforce and minimize the drag. There's the powertrain that generate the power and torque to make it move. There's the suspension to keep the tires correctly on the ground. There's the brakes to stop very quickly, and the tires, which ultimately provide the connection to the road surface. Formula One cars have braking forces of about 5G, that's 5 times gravity, and that's about the quickest braking you will ever see on any sort of vehicle, land vehicle or others. 2G accelerations, going from as you're coming out of corners, and there's 3 to 4G accelerations in cornering. So it's quite an aggressive machine. The cars are evolving throughout the year. A racing car is made up of about 25,000 components. The top race teams are making 3,000 new parts every week. And they use, nowadays, simulation to start assessing the benefits of changes they might make. They're making performance upgrades, reliability upgrades throughout the season. At the beginning of the season and the end of the season, the cars are about 1 or 2 seconds difference in terms of their performance. That's the scale of development is taking place. Where simulation plays its part, it's become essentially the hub of the development wheel in Formula One. Okay, so let's start thinking a bit about what happens on a race weekend. And the first element is data. So if you're going to use data and models to understand how cars perform better, then you need to find where those sources would be. One of them is the split time information, essentially the lap times that you get at the racetrack. And this is the equivalent of a sort of a complex stopwatch, if you like, to see what's going on. Each of the race cars has about 200 sensors on the car on race day. During the Friday practices, there will be more sensors added to get an even clearer picture of what is going on. There are weather feeds from satellite pictures to be able to understand how the environment is changing over the course of the race weekend. And then there is feeds from television, photography, track maps, and also historical information of what you did at the track last year, what happened at a different track last week, etc. So it's a very rich in data, and part of the challenge is sort of bringing those different data sources together. If we move on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about telemetry. So if you go back to the 1980s, you had the first collection of data, and in that case, when the car came into the garage, you would download the data when the car was in the garage to see what had happened. As we went into the early 90s, we had the burst telemetry, where you would send information across via wireless links as you pass the garages. That moved into a real-time telemetry, where you're sending live data while you're on the track, and generally we were getting between 50–70% coverage, so a lot of missing data. When we got into sort of the mid-90s, we had the concept of multi-burst, where we were bursting bunches of information across at different parts of the track where the coverage was good, to the point where we are now, where we have real-time live data going across from the track. What you're trying to achieve here is the situation, what you're trying to achieve is where you're able to send the data live so you can act upon it as you get new information. Each car is sending about 2 billion data points in the period of a 2-hour race, and that data is also being sent back via fiber to the factory, which is often on the other side of the world, so that everyone involved in the race is able to see a current view of what's going on. Okay, so if we look to the next slide, so you've got this huge amount of data, and how do you make sense of it? How do you react to it? How do you understand the consequences, actions you might take? And this is where you start using models and simulation. And what all of the race teams have is fairly complex models of the engines, of the tires, of the chassis. And what they're using this is to understand if actions that they take, what will it do to the life of the engine? How will the tires degrade? When will the fuel last? Bear in mind that as per the regulations now in Formula One, teams are only allowed to use 3 engines for a whole season. So they can't afford to waste an engine in a race. They have 2 or 3 sets of tires to last for the whole race. And they have 100 kilograms of fuel, which, as it happens, is not enough to be able to run at full power throughout the race. So they have to manage all of those things. And so what you end up with is these models allow you to add to the real data you're getting from the car by telemetry and create a virtual data set which is much higher and provides greater granularity without having to carry the sensors on the car. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about disaster response, because there's a lot of things happening here in the motor racing side. So what you have when the disaster strikes is you have this huge accumulation of things happening, and you have imperfect data, messy data. There is some of the sort of structured data that you will get via the internet, via mobile networks, where they exist, where they haven't broken. Also, if you're lucky, there will be a lot of unstructured data that you're getting from things like Facebook and Twitter, where people are making observations. The crowds are telling you something about what's going on. So you have this mixture between incomplete and slightly messy data and somewhat uncertain data from a group of different observers. Now, where this can help you is if you can start using some modeling, start using some analytics to bring together the data, to orchestrate it, and start establishing a picture of an evolving situation. And what that starts to let you do is to make some predictions in the short term about what might happen, and also to be able to assess what's the impact of interventions you might make. So I'm going to pause there, Gabby, just to have a pause for breath.
Yes, Peter, there's three parallels between what you're talking about in the race world and what happens in the humanitarian environment. And there are a couple things that come to mind that I'd love to talk through with you. One is talking about imperfect data. And as someone who works with information, we know that all information is incomplete. But particularly when you're talking about working in a humanitarian situation where you're ultimately serving vulnerable people, what do you think about how decision makers can be comfortable, become more comfortable working with imperfect or incomplete data to make really, really important decisions on the fly?
Okay, well, the simple answer to that is once you start using the data and you start to see that it's giving you cues that help, you will become more comfortable. And the motor racing environment is no different there. When we started using data to work out best strategies for racing, it took a little while for sort of team principals and race engineers to see that it was helping them rather than conflicting with some of their own tacit knowledge. Where you can help is that you can use history of past events and some sort of simulations of existing events to sort of frame a story. And the new information you get, however messy, is just adding richness to that. But ultimately, you have to just believe that the data is providing you a better view of the evolving situation, and it just helps you to be brave because it can help sort of determine interventions you might take, but also start giving you a view of what might happen if you make those interventions.
Wonderful. And as you're thinking about simulations, I know that in the humanitarian world, we hold a lot of those, but they're mostly in person or they're mostly talk through. I think a place that we can really grow is learning how to simulate certain humanitarian events, certain humanitarian responses digitally, and that comes to predictive analysis. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say next about how to do that, how that's done in the racing world, and how we can learn from that in the humanitarian environment.
Yeah, well, before I get back into the presentation, I think the short answer to that is you start simple and you build your simulations and your models up. Again, if I go back to motor racing, when we first started using data and simulations, they were a way of framing the data better, and they have grown over time as your understanding grows over time. And so it's how you work together between the people who have the domain knowledge and the data scientists to be able to create a better story. But yes, so let's move on to the next slide then. Okay, winning the race. So a few things about strategies for racing. the best strategy to have is to have a fast car and the best driver, without a doubt. Having said that, knowing the competition is also important. And if I'm to relate this back to disaster response, a good strategy is to have good people and good equipment, and knowing your competitors is, if you like, knowing the enemy, having good situational awareness about how the disaster is emerging and how it's moving. You can learn a lot from history to look ahead, and a lot of predictive analytics is based on using current knowledge to improve your historical knowledge of things. Now, what we do in racing, one of the fundamental things that you're measuring is lap time, and ultimately, if your lap time is less than everyone else, then you will win the race. And part of it is, how do I use this fairly simple data, which is consistent, the lap time, present it well and differently to be able to tell a compelling story. Now, the pictures you see in front of you are examples of how lap time can and is presented at the racetrack to many people who are watching, who are managing the race. The wheel with the dots on it is simply showing how the spacing between the cars is changing over the race. And that is incredibly helpful in determining the impact of, when you have a pit stop, when you're going to come back into traffic, how far in front or how far behind you are. And presented well, you can get an instant view of how the race is evolving. The picture with all of the wiggly lines on it is essentially showing lap by lap the lap time differences. And by plotting it in this way, you get an instant picture from looking at the slopes of the line, of the comparative speeds of all of the cars in the race, and how things are changing as the tires start to wear, as the car becomes lighter, as there's less fuel. And so taking a simple measure, which is lap time, presented in two different ways, gives a very clear story about both how the race is evolving and what happens at the end of the race. So that's interesting. What you can also do, sorry, go back to the previous, this one. What you can also do is run simulations as you learn more about the competition. And so throughout the race weekend, the teams are running Monte Carlo simulations, which are essentially a Bayesian mathematics, to work out what is the impact of different strategies on the outcome of the race. And you can use that to decide, if I want to get a win, what is the best strategy? If I want to get first, second, or third, podium finish, what is the best strategy? If I just want to win points, what is the best strategy? And so you can start using that to distill a very complex situation into something which is manageable. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a moment about pit stops. And the reason is that if you have watched any motor racing, whether it be Formula One or NASCAR or IndyCar, the pit stops have become almost poetry in motion, when a car will come into the pits and the tires will be changed in a ridiculously short length of time. In the case of Formula One, you have 17 or 20 people who are surrounding the car when it comes in. Each has a job to do, and each has a job to do in the right order. These same people, for most of the race, are sitting calmly in the garage, and then they're called upon in a moment to perform at their highest level. What you have managed in Formula One is when it first started in 1950, the pit stops took over a minute to complete. Nowadays, they are happening in less than 2 seconds. Now, the difference between motor racing and disaster response is, generally speaking, in motor racing, the same team of mechanics will be working throughout the season, so they can practice to do what their task. You don't have the same luxury in disaster response because it's often an ad hoc team, sometimes similar, same people, but often different groups of people. But the general process of being able to do things in the right order to generate trust and respect and urgency amongst the team is as important. And it's quite a good metaphor for the sort of activity that we're talking about. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. So the race is finished, and there is a moment in time where teams celebrate or commiserate. But then the next race is generally in 2 weeks' time, maybe sometimes even 1 week's time. So gives you very little time to find the right questions, and certainly very little time to find the right answers. And sorts of things that you might be asking yourself at the end of the race is, why is someone else's car so fast coming out of the corners? Try to work out what they are doing. Or why are my tires wearing out so quickly compared to others? What am I doing wrong? In where there's a catastrophic effect, say the engine blows up, why did the engine blow up? There could be many reasons. And so what happens between races is you're trying to understand problems and resolve them. Sometimes you need to resolve or at least do something before the next race. Decide what people are doing that is better so that you can either mimic or copy what others have done, and always bringing new developments to the car. Developing a Formula One car is relentless. If you don't do anything, you go backwards. And so I suppose the key message is one that you just have to be quick, but you can't afford to hurry. You have to make things perform better, but ensure that reliability stays the same. Okay, so let's go back to disaster response. So what have I got? Well, there is history of many disasters that have happened before. There's information about what is happening on the ground now. And if I start using models, analytics, I can get a picture about what might happen in the near future if I do things. I go back to an earlier statement that a disaster, when it's happening, is a hostile and dynamic environment. And I've had things changing quickly in time and space. And what we can look to with data and technology is a way of staying ahead of the game. If I go to a sort of a military view on this, it's knowing the enemy and being able to manage my defense, my offense, and my supply lines to make things work. And so there are a number of steps that you need to take. The first one is start collecting data from different sources, some of it before the event, some of it during. Then where the analytics come into place, where the models, is framing that data to start making sense of things. It's providing the sort of connections between the data to understand the story. And then once you've done that, you can start helping to make decisions and act upon them. So if we go to the next slide, the sorts of data that we have. Historical data, that's information which may be anecdotal, it may be economic or whatever about what has happened in the past. The virtual data comes from models that we create. Some of those can be quite simple models, some becoming more complex. We then have things that are changing in space and time. I can get satellite views of the disaster area to get a picture of the topography. There will be information coming from news channels. There'll be weather information coming through. If the mobile network is still in place or a temporary mobile network is put in place, there'll be information about the movement of people. There will also be things coming over, observations coming from the ground via social media, from communications with aid workers, etc. So I have this rather sort of messy and sometimes different sets of data for different disasters that I can start pulling together to understand what's going on. But then move into the next slide. And this is when the sort of analytics come into play. I've got the things changing over space and time, and so what I really want is a set of mathematics, analytics that allows me to ingest the different data and to be able to look at different things that I might want to do. Now, there are different people making local decisions at a disaster site, and some things are more important than others. One group might be very interested in ensuring that the flow of aid is going to the right people. Another will be trying to clear the disaster area of debris. There will be different things that are important, and so being able to get a good collective view of what are the right decisions to take to be able to get things moving in the right way is important. The other thing is being able to look at how the disaster is evolving and what is happening to the people on the ground, to the workers and aid on the ground, and both be able to understand the patterns of behavior and make things flow in the best way, but also to see when conditions are beginning to deteriorate and need interventions to change. The other thing which is incredibly important is being able to present information in a very clear way, because the clarity of presenting the options clearly allows people to make decisions. And it's presenting the options clearly and at the same time providing some idea of likely consequences, which will take the pain out of decision making. None of us can hold lots and lots of options in our head at any time. Too many, trying to keep these in our head is very tiring. And so what the analytics is trying to do is to make that a little bit easier. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about Living Planet, which is the company I'm working for at the moment. And this is by way of example of sorts of tools that might be used. What we do, our day job at Living Planet is so-called smart cities, and we're looking at improving performance and availability of real estate and infrastructure. So that's the essence. And part of that is trying to improve the flow of people and things to make things work better. Now, part of that is a data platform, and this is being able to ingest both time series and unstructured data together. We call this our urban operating system, but that or something like that is a sort of data platform that you might need to start looking at this sort of messy data that you're acquiring at a disaster site. Analytics that we've created, which initially were to do with the cities. One is Wisdom, which is genetic algorithms, and that's really a sort of time and space analytics, which was originally developed for looking at land use problems. You know, how can I use land better? But it's dealing with complex problems where that are represented by many different types of data, which is really what a disaster site becomes. And the third one I was just going to mention briefly is what we call Schrodinger, and this is looking at patterns in data. And you look at patterns to be able to see when things start to change, when things start to deteriorate. So all of these things are things which are applicable to disaster problems. So I'm going to pause there again, Gabby, to get a breath.
Yes. So Peter, a couple things come to mind, and I would encourage all those listening in to drop your questions in the Q&A in the chat box. Excuse me. So one thing that comes to mind is when you're talking about analytics and systems, and really more importantly, especially when it comes to my role at NetHope, is my goal is to always present the information in a way that's really easy for decision makers to understand. You point that as an important issue as well. When you think about Living Planet and applying how you've built Living Planet to humanitarian NGOs, what kind of people should NGOs be looking for when it comes to those with really great analytic and visual skills?
Okay, I think to build up systems that are useful, you need a very good blend of people with domain knowledge who know about what happens out at the disaster sites, and good data scientists who are able to frame that data better. The reason it's important to have both is any sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence, which is essentially what all this analytics is about, needs to be trained by people who know what's going on. So the maths needs to be trained by the people who will ultimately use it to make their life better. If I use a rather sort of croaky metaphor here, if I'm thirsty, I need water and a bucket. The data science can provide me with a bucket, but I still need to fill it with knowledge that comes from the people who know about things. In terms of the types of data scientists that you need, I guess the best ones are the ones that are willing to embrace the imperfection of the data and accept that the quality of the data, the references to time and space will never be perfect, and so you need to deal with that. They also need to deal with the fact that over time the data loses value, so being able to pay attention to things which are happening now and balance that against things that have happened before is a sort of an interesting balance between change and persistence that you get with complex systems. And I guess the other thing I would say, which I said a bit earlier, is start simple and build upwards. Don't try to model a complex system with a complex model immediately, because it just ain't going to work that way.
That's good. One other point before we go to the open, before we wrap up the presentation and go to the other questions that are there. Something that struck me about something that you said was really looking at the competition and seeing what they're doing well in order to improve their own operations. And what I see in the humanitarian industry is There's a lot of effort for collaboration between humanitarian NGOs, but I don't think thought about or have done a good job just yet of really seeing what other people are doing well and incorporating that into our own operations. We're always thinking about how to improve what we do, but I don't know if we pay as much attention as to what other people are doing. How would you advise looking at how other humanitarian NGOs are operating in a disaster where things are moving really, really fast, and you have so many of your own priorities to address?
Yes, it's
hard.
I don't think this is just an issue for NGOs, to be honest. I think, unfortunately, few people focus on what is going well and try to build upon it, as opposed to finding out what's going wrong and trying to fix it. I think the answer is that you can, whenever you see someone seeing something working very well, you should question it. You should say, why is that so good? In the racing analogy is, if a car is so much faster than another one, you look at it and say, what are they doing to make that car so fast? Think it through. This is a sort of a little bit of brainstorming to understand. It's helpful in motor racing because you have everything's framed by physics, but within the sort of humanitarian space, you can look at things when they're going well and say, why did that work so well? Was it just that they were lucky? Was it that it was not as difficult as the disasters I always look after? Or did something just work outright? And you know, it may be that you say, actually, that worked really well because in this case, the mobile telephone network was working, and so communication was great. And so the answer is not, well, I hope not, that when it happens to me, the mobile communication's in place. You say, I've got to make sure that if it's not in place, I can get it up and running, because I know things will work better if people can talk with each other. And so it's understanding what makes things work better and, if necessarily, ensuring that you get that in place.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, so final slide. This is the call to action. This webinar was a little bit of a taster for what we will be looking at again, and in a little bit more focus at the NetHope Global Summit in Dublin, which takes place for a week in November. It's actually running from the week from the 5th to the 9th, but rather selfishly, I've just put Thursday, the 8th of November there, because that's when the F1 session is taking place. So any of you who are going to that event, then I would recommend you come to that session. What we will be establishing following on from that is a workshop, which is going to lead to our first pilot project, which is trying to translate some of the best practice and technology that we've sort of briefly talked about today into disaster response. And part of that will be considering the different types of data which might be found, and we may have access to already, but just either not using it or not realizing its importance. And also thinking through the sorts of interventions that could be better timed or better judged in response to a disaster. So we're looking at how we can use information to make decisions better, to be able to intervene more quickly, which really is the essence of today's talk, I'd have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. I think what we're going to do is we're going to start going through the Q&A that's come from our audience today. And we'd love to hear your perspectives on questions that our audience has. So I'll to share the first one.
So yeah, Peter, thank you very much for a very, very interesting discussion, and clearly we see the parallels, and the more we can make an overlap between these two worlds, I think the more we can benefit from the technology and what you're talking about. But the first question that came in, I thought it was interesting. Do you feel that your platform or the solution is specifically well suited to a natural versus man-made disaster? Does it matter, and if so, why?
It's suited to both, and generally speaking, there are a lot of natural disasters that are man-made as well. It just happens to be that the actions of people were a long time ago to create an issue. But I would say that geography, weather, politics, demographics, economics, all of these things will always come into play one way or another. And the key is being able to find sort of signals in the data, if you like, or the types of data that gives you an indicator of each of those, and to be able to sort of find a way of feeding it together into the data platform. And we have some experience of that when looking at the land use problems, because they're essentially political, environmental, economic anyway. It needs a little bit of work and attention, which I think that the workshop is a first step towards that, to be able to establish how you can gain some useful information about both types. So, long-winded answer to say you need to be able to tackle both.
Well, just a quick follow-up to that. It sounds like you know, it's not only disaster response, but potentially, you know, as the term we used in predictive analytics, and maybe forecasting a disaster of sorts. And you mentioned back in 1950, a pit stop took over a minute or a minute. Now it takes 2 seconds. Do you think that this maybe the advent of IoT or can create an environment where we're getting so much data on an ongoing basis that we'll be better at predicting disasters of all kinds over time?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of disasters that can be forecast or predicted. The problem is usually one of how well you can predict the timing. So, you know, for example, I might be able to predict an earthquake, but until I get close to when it happens, I can't be certain of the timing of it. And so I think one of the challenges is to be able to forecast that there is a potential disaster coming in a region, and so pay attention to it, and then look for changes in the data, which, as you get closer to when it actually happens, to be able to give you a finer prediction of it. A little bit like at the moment, you can get a 5-day weather forecast, which is not bad, but a 1-day weather forecast is a lot better. But you can use both to some advantage in your planning. And I think that that's the way you would go. You'd want to be able to forecast that there is a likelihood of a disaster in a region, and then increase the attention level when the signals are coming through that it's getting more likely.
Wonderful. Building on what you're saying, Peter, we have a question related to data sources. So the question is, it looks like some of the data sources may be very common between Formula One and disasters, so looking at satellites and weather. You mentioned that sensors on the cars may be parallel to local data in a disaster. Can you discuss, from your perspective, what local data sources you think might be most important for providing value in disaster response?
Okay, I think that I bang on a little bit about the importance of the mobile networks if they're there, because one piece of local data that you will get if the mobile network is in place is some idea of the movement of people, which you can get from that. In the same way that that's the key piece of information that makes a lot of the satellite navigation systems so good at showing you where the traffic jams are, because they can look at how the mobile phones are moving and use that to detect when unusual behavior is going on. So I think mobile phones turning people into local sensors is important. That also adds to the fact that if someone has a mobile phone and they have access to social media, then you also get some observations from the ground that you can add to that. So I think that is one. The other sort of local sensing that I'm sure is used in some areas, not all, is drones with cameras, because cameras are a very rich source of sensing information about how things are happening locally. So sort of cheap drones with cameras is important, and that also adds a sort of real-time view to what you're provided from satellites, which are updated less frequently and depend a little bit about whether the disaster happens to be on the right path for satellites. So yeah, cameras and mobile phones I think are key sources of information, and also they're not special as special sensors as some other things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the last question I have is, excuse me, it sounds as though you, Peter, are advocating for, quote, data and decision disaster preparedness, end quote. What do you see as, who do you see as being the key stakeholders for data and decision preparedness?
Okay, for data, I think a step is a number of the NGOs need to get together just to see what data they have already that either they're not sharing or they don't sort of perhaps appreciate the importance or what might be hidden in that data. So that's part of it. Where there is information that is not being accessed, that is useful, it may be that relationships with people providing satellite imagery, relationships with the telecoms need to be deeper and richer to be able to get more information about how things were before the disaster struck and what's going on the ground. And other sources of data, there may be special sources of data that becomes part of the tool chest, which is taken out to the disaster zone, which may happen already. Things like drones being taken out, temporary networks being taken out. In the same way that at the racetrack, we sort of build the telemetry network on the Thursday and pull it down on the Sunday night. That's because it is important to be able to provide the data that you need to be able to race the cars safely. And so in a disaster response, you may well have this toolkit of things that you take along with you to provide you with a sort of a better network, if you like. as far as the decision process is concerned, you have to think carefully about what type of tools you might have, and then there is a sort of a cultural work, if you like, a cultural shift to get people comfortable and familiar with the tools, so they can start using them to assist in decision making. And it goes back to, I think, one of your earlier questions, Gabby, where, you know, how do you get people to trust data? Well, the answer is that you start slowly, they start becoming comfortable, and then at some point they believe that it is helping them, and then they're brave enough to use the data to help them make decisions.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. We're coming to the top of the hour, and we'll probably wrap up here a little bit, but hope that we'll be able to continue this discussion at the summit, as you suggest. This whole talk, and also the whole talk about data and the importance of having various sources of data, reminds me of the webinar we did earlier with Facebook and their disaster map offering to organizations that are reacting to natural disasters. And maybe Dublin might be a good place to overlay these two things and look at how Facebook's disaster maps might be one of the sources of information that you're calling for here. So with that, I want to thank you, Peter, for a fantastic talk and an inspirational lot of content. I also want to thank Gabby for producing this and getting it all together. Great preparation and excellent execution. I want to thank the audience for great questions and participation. I hope this has been useful for everyone. We will, again, we will have a session with Peter at the NetHope Summit for those of you who are going to be there, but we'll also continue this series of webinars with Gabby and on crisis information and on other topics as we go along. So please check the NetHope Solutions Center for our webinar calendar, and also please take 2 or 3 minutes to look at the webinar satisfaction poll that will pop up in your browser as soon as we're done here. Thank you very much, everyone, and I wish everybody a great rest of your day. We'll be back together again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.